Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As always, you're with Mike.
And Ian.
As we complete our rereading of the Aubrey Matron canon of our favorite author, Patrick O'Brien. Ian, on this auspicious occasion, could you tell us a little bit about where we have been and where we're heading?
With pleasure, Mike. Last week, we were taking the helicopter view of all of O'Brien's life, and in particular, the stage of his life when he was becoming famous from writing these novels, and when Dean King was in the process, along with some other journalists in the world, of uncovering some of the realities of the story that had shaped the man that wrote the books that we've been talking about for years now, for years. And the years have rolled by. We've got to the end of our reading of the words of Patrick O'Brien that relate to the canon. So, having also before that spent some time with The Golden Ocean and The Unknown Shore, which we haven't forgotten about, this week, Mike, we are taking care of what in the American market is called 21, what for the Brits is called The Final Unfinished Voyage of Jack Aubrey, the final book, the uncompleted book. So, Mike, we should let people know right away that there are going to be spoilers, because if you haven't read the book, it's going to be pretty hard for us to break it down. There are only 3 chapters, that's 65 handwritten pages left to us by O'Brien. It's a draft that ends in mid-sentence. And Mike, we've already talked about this. There's another piece of 20th century media that kind of rings a bell here for us.
Isn't it true? I mean, The Sopranos, we're thinking, right, is this where they got the ending for The Sopranos? Because it's the same way. And you and I had talked, I think, a couple of years ago going, hey, when we get to 21, maybe we should just do like The Sopranos, read that unfinished line and then just go to black. But I think we're not going to do that.
No, I think we're not. We've got plenty to talk about. And you all know, I think you all know, because I've said it a few times now, that, Mike, I think you had read 21 already, maybe a little while ago. I had not picked up nor listened to a word of 21 until like 3 days ago. So, this being me, and I wanted to kind of put it in context, I'll share with you some of what we know about this book and about the context. Having previously been back in the 1950s when O'Brien wrote Golden Ocean and The Unknown Shore, we're now in 1999. Patrick O'Brien, widowed from Mary, in a bad way for a number of reasons, had moved from Collioure to Dublin, staying as a guest of Trinity College in Dublin. Now, by this time, the Daily Telegraph in London and some other journalistic outlets had already begun to reveal to the public numerous things about O'Brien, including the fact that his Irishness was fanciful, to say the least. And we believe that he might have been a little bit embarrassed to be accepting the hospitality of Trinity College Dublin when they had doctored him not many months before this on the presumption that he was an Irish citizen. Right. Anyhow, they were still kindly welcoming O'Brien into the doors. Blue at the Mizzen had been published that November, the November of 1999. And over this winter of 99 into 2000, O'Brien, sitting in his lodgings in Dublin, had started out to write another Aubrey Maturin novel. Now, you can all read, and Mike, you and I will discuss what seemed to be his intention with this book, but all we know about his intentions for sure is that he picked up his pen and he wrote. We will never know what title he intended for it, in truth. We will never know whether he had the aim somehow of bringing the series to an end, because Patrick O'Brien died 65 pages and 3 chapters into this book on January 2nd, 2000. And Mike, I've been holding up for you on the camera here my beautiful hardback copy. It was a family gift many, many Christmases ago of the HarperCollins edition. O'Brien's family and the publishers arranged for this to be published in 2004, so 4 years later, with the title of, for the UK market, The Final Unfinished Voyage of Jack Aubrey, and for the American market, simply 21. The British edition that I've got here, which is beautiful, has some facsimile pages of the manuscript. In fact, the entire manuscript for the book with typescript facing the facsimile manuscript, so you can see his handwriting. It features a beautiful painting on the front cover of HMS Surprise, thankfully not sentimentally sailing off into the sunset, but entirely appropriately sailing bravely, alone in the ocean towards the viewer. Interestingly, also on the back, above the blurbs, There's a beautiful Jeff Hunt sketch, a very touching sketch of HMS Surprise in mourning with her yards cockbilled. And I don't know whether that sketch was something commissioned by Hunt for this or whether he'd done it as part of his earlier work. There's a very handsome foreword by a guy called William Walgrave, who Brits will remember as a Conservative cabinet minister in the 80s and 90s, and who became the Charlton Heston level super fan for Patrick O'Brian here in the UK. And in addition to Walgrave's foreword, there's an even more handsome afterword by the American historian and novelist Richard Snow, all included in this publication. And we'll borrow some words of Richard Snow's when we get to the end here. Now, Mike, you chose to read the book. Tell us, well, let me put it another way. I chose not to read the book, and we'll talk in a second about why. You chose to read the book, so pitch us on this. Why might somebody who's got to the end of Blue at the Mizzen go ahead and read 21?
Well, I hope they don't do it for the reason that I did it. This goes back a good ways. You had introduced me to O'Brien. I was reading through the series for the first time, and I was diagnosed with cancer, a very advanced kidney cancer on both kidneys. And I actually didn't think I would finish the series. I didn't know that I would last long enough to read them all. So I was consuming them. So I certainly wasn't going to go to the great beyond, having not read them all if I had that chance. So in my view, I didn't have a chance. Were I, in the midst of circumnavigations and thinking about it differently, I might go, well, maybe I'll wait. I don't know. But I was really glad that I did, and glad that we're back to it again here.
I know. Yeah. And maybe I'll add to if you've never read it yet, if like me, you'd had it on your shelf, but therefore, Mike, we should add to the list of reasons to read it, because as you advance in your years, it might seem complacent to believe that there's always going to be plenty of good time to open 21.
Amen to that.
Wasn't on my mind. Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
So maybe if you're one of the Patrick O'Brian readers who's chosen not to read it yet, it might be because you think that it's unfair to the author, to his memory, to hold up a part-completed work alongside fully worked through, fully polished, edited masterpieces. I think that's a fair point of view, and we'll test out whether the book stands up. It might also be just because as a person, you'd rather go back to the beginning of a circumnavigation than experience something that kind of shoots your fox, to use O'Brien's phrase, that says, okay, it really definitely is the end now. Either of those and many other reasons besides will be reasons not, but we've decided to. I think this pays off for us, Mike, because, spoiler, there's some perfectly excellent O'Brian writing to enjoy in this book. There's some great time for us to spend in the company of our good friends, Jack and Stephen. And it promises to give us some idea of, maybe, with a bit of extrapolation, where the plot and where the character arcs of Jack and Stephen and where HMS Surprise herself might have ended up. And then if you're the O'Brian stamp collector completist, then this is absolutely a book that you need. Besides being the remaining final truly O'Brian words about truly Jack and Stephen that were ever written, it gives you, by dint of the manuscript and the typescript, some idea of his writing method. That even in his handwriting, there are clues about how he was thinking, and in his edits and his little markups and even sketches and doodles, you see a little bit of what his thought process was like, and his state of being at this stage of his life, which I can say, like, this doesn't read like the work of somebody who was wrestling to get stuff on the page. This reads like the work of somebody who was having a great time.
Normally at this point we'd be going, so where did we leave our heroes last? And if you are thinking about that, going not just the context historically of this book, but also where was the story last? It would have ended at chapter 10 of Blue in the Mizzen. Now, that was episode 185. So if you're kind of moving through the podcast, I know, well, this is like Christmas 2023. And we spent, 3/4 of a year getting back to 21 here. If we go back to that, Jack of the Surprise had cut out the best Peruvian man of war, the Esmeralda, of changing the balance of power to favor the Chilean Navy there. And so Jack, a.k.a. Thomas Cochrane, was at that time in that book training the Chilean Navy. However, the Chileans didn't pay the Surprise's hands their earned prize money as agreed, and so Jack was free to leave for the River Plate and at that time what was written the HMS Implacable to hoist his flag blue at the mizzen. And we left him at the end of chapter 10, asking for a course to Cape Pilar and Magellan Strait. And I think we are going to join him at about exactly that point. So if you do want to catch up, find episode 185 or find chapter 10 of Blue of the Mizzen and then jump in with us here at chapter 1.
Mike, I'm ready to bring us up to date. Would you please take us into chapter 1? Where are we? Who's doing what?
Well, Stephen is writing a letter to Christine Woods, and that's, all right, let's put our heads back into chapter 10. That's the widow he had proposed to before leaving for Chile. And he's been gone for a long time. But he is, of course, interrupted to attend to a ship's boy who had thrown a maul too high, misjudged its role, and hit himself on the head. And I'm hoping that this is not an outcome for Stephen's proposal, not an omen here about the outcome here. Well, Stephen leaves word for his mate, Dr. Jacob. And we've gone so far back in time, covered so many books since then. We remember Dr. Jacob, his fellow intelligence agent, fellow doctor, that when Jacob returned from the Surprise's tender, the Ringle, he's over there now, to kind of take care of this guy. And O'Brien uses Stephen's thoughts about what to write about to tell us that they are, in fact, in Magellan Strait. They've got and have had beautiful weather, fine winds, and are on a happy ship carrying their fighting captain to hoist his flag as everyone on the ship is helping to create what they believe is going to be the most handsome ensign in the service for Jack.
Oh, it's a really nice moment. I remember as well the moment when they were putting his commissioning pendant up when he was made Commodore. It's this nice gesture of his ship family saying, "Captain, we've got you here. We're happy." Isn't it a great moment when the subordinates are happy for the leader? Hold that thought for later on in this chapter. Right. We also get a bit of exposition from O'Brien. It's really funny that 21 books in, he still takes care to catch up the reader who might be picking this up for the first time. I can only imagine that there are very, very, very few people reading 21 for the first time without any Stephen Maturin backstory, but never mind. We get a bit of re-exposition, and we're talking about all the things that Stephen could tell Christine in this letter, or indeed had planned to tell her before he was interrupted by the accident with the ship's boy. He had completed, rather the Surprise had completed his mission in South America. Jack was heading to join the South African squadron in the River Plate, so on the coast of Argentina. He was ordered to go aboard HMS Suffolk, which is a change. It was going to be HMS Implacable, as at the end of Blue of the Mizzen. Surprise is still His Majesty's hired hydrographical vessel rather than His Majesty's frigate. The Surprise is due to return to England to carry Jack's official dispatch and to present 2 men for their lieutenant exams and to carry reports of the cover activity, the New World hydrography that the Surprise had been ostensibly engaged upon. Stephen's duties as an intelligence agent had prevented him from telling Christine some of this in the letter. Always in his life, we've had Stephen have to be very careful and sort of circumspect in the things that he writes in, even the most intimate personal letters. And here it is again. So he can't tell her about the details of the mission. He can't tell her about the victories. All these victories are achieved despite all the competing, rival factions and juntas in Chile, despite the shabby treatment, as we've said, Mike, that was doled out to the Surprise at the end, allowing them nonetheless to return victorious, not yet completely fully paid, but at least refitted, and carrying somebody whose career has made an interesting naval step. That's young Hansen, who is, as we remember, and as the text reminds us, is the unacknowledged but much beloved illegitimate son of Prince William, Admiral the Duke of Clarence. So we have a member of the royal family. We have an heir to the throne here aboard. And he did well, right? In Blue at the Mizzen, I think we were all ready to feel bad towards him, but he did great.
Well, the news of Jack's famous victory, cutting out the Esmeralda, and the preservation of Chile would have already been known in London because, as we'll remember from Blue at the Mizzen, and also as O'Brien goes back and reminds us now, members of the Royal Society had taken Jack's initial dispatches back to the Admiralty with them. And that news had led to Jack's long sought promotion, the ability to hoist his flag. Now,
Yeah.
despite these victories and the assistance in creating the Chilean Navy, local politics and old resentments against England, especially by the Argentinians, remembering the English taking Buenos Aires earlier, and English Protestantism, the fact that these were all Protestants in a Catholic country, more or less, have soured feelings about an English presence in South America. So there was a lot of, ooh, yay, England, you're going to help us kind of take this country back. But now it's kind of gone the other way. And so we're in the text, they're putting into San Pedro this small seal and fishing port. And Stephen tells Jack, my dear Jack, in the backwoods of America, always love hearing that, in the backwoods of America, they say that an evil reputation is like an inextinguishable debt. And we have been so maligned on the Pacific coast that it might be prudent to arm the boats or even to hail the ships so close to the strand that your great guns command the whole settlement. So Stephen's saying, okay, before we put in here to grab some supplies, you may want to be ready here, and pulling wisdom from the American backwoods, always a great idea, as we're seeing even today in 2024.
Stephen the frontiersman, I love it.
Exactly.
Well, it turns out that for reasons that we might establish shortly, things are not quite as bad as Stephen feared. Arming the boats turns out not to have been necessary. There's certainly some resentment. Hansen and Daniel make a quick kind of survey of the area. The ship manages to acquire, at the very least, some sort of third-class fruit and vegetables, some indifferent potatoes, some wilted cabbages at an exorbitant price. And there's some naturalizing, some botanizing, you might say, for Stephen and Amos Jacob to do. They dissect birds, it says, mammals, marine plants, and creatures of the strait. And all of this is getting reported by Stephen to his letter to Christine. She's the only woman, Stephen knows, who can truly appreciate the details of all this discovery that he's doing, and she will be delighted to know that these snowy and inhospitable shores shelter at least one green and red parrot or parakeet, as well as a minute hummingbird found in the fuchsias in Tierra del Fuego. Oh my God, certainly the parrots, I've got a fairly fresh memory of parrots on what they call pole parrots, because I think we had that in either Golden Ocean or Unknown Shore. Not the last time we're going to find O'Brien in this book reaching all the way back to the very, very beginnings of his nautical writings for a couple of little signifiers here.
Well, Hansen comes in, we've talked about Hansen now, with Dr. Jacobs' reminder of Stephen's appointment to continue dissecting an undescribed dolphin with him. So another great, advance for science. And then both Stephen and Hansen's repeating watches sound from their respective pockets at the same time. Hansen's is a gift from his father. We've already talked about that member of royalty. And Stephen's is a replacement for the one he had left with Christine when he left her. So a great way to kind of nod back with these repeating watches here. The doctors make little progress in this dissection because the ship is now in the midst of some pretty violent motions from a blow that's come up outside. And Jack calls them out to deal with some resulting casualties, including the senior Lieutenant Harding, who, as O'Brien writes, to his own infinite shame, needs his fibula and tibia splinted here. Awkward Davis comes in, says that he's here on the captain's orders with compliments to bring them on deck carefully so that they don't fall. And Jack has really warned Davis about this, to see the rigging stuffed, as he says, with pole parrots and God knows what. So again, we're back. More parrots, more local things. And this kind of interesting thing, we've got these repeating watches. We remember Stephen's repeating watch, one of the last times he was in the Andes, and a not so great situation. And now we've got a storm raging on deck, and let's see what's up there.
Now, this is another bizarre moment. I think there's a little bit of juxtaposition. The lieutenant fell over and broke his leg, and that's described in the text as being a fairly routine thing. I wouldn't fancy having a tib-fib fracture set without plaster on a ship, but never mind. It's described as fairly routine for the lieutenant. It's not routine for all these birds that have ended up coming aboard. It's really quite a grim scene. There are these pole parrots, there are these hummingbirds, many other kinds of minute birds that are dead from having been dashed against the sails in this storm. The rigging, the deck, and the scuppers are littered with what O'Brien rather gruesomely calls the still brilliant fragments of these poor birds, just as the storm starts to die away. Stephen finds that he can save some of the larger birds. He works with Dr. Jacob to collect the samples, to make notes of the others. But it's a very ominous scene. Birds in the rigging sounds like fun, but I think birds dashed to pieces sounds like foreshadowing of something.
Right.
Now, the next 3 days, the weather stays turbulent. There's seaweed, there's kelp torn from the seabed that floats to the surface, sometimes bringing the steering into danger. There are unexpected currents, strange tides off the headlands. And again, Mike, we heard about that in Golden Ocean and Unknown Shore. They still make it through Magellan Strait in 9 days and 3 hours, which is pretty brisk. And they turn north out into the Atlantic, past the Cape of the 11,000 Virgins, which we have seen before and talked about before, I think, Mike.
Right. We did. Well, Jack's now thinking, given how fast we've moved through the strait, we've got time to look into some ports and still easily make their rendezvous with the Admiral's squadron. And he describes it to Stephen. He says it's actually 3 squadrons, and Jack's is the smallest. And Stephen says, well, hold on a minute. Why are we stopping in South America again? Jack, you'd said we have plenty of supplies to get us, to the squadron, to get us home. And Jack says, well, he just doesn't want to risk scurvy if any of their present supplies don't answer later in the voyage. They've got everything packed. Some of it turns out not to be so good. Let's get it while we can. We got access to fresh water, fresh meat. And he believes that Lord Leighton is going to be fully supplied and ready to sail when they join him in the River Plate. And Jack doesn't want to do anything to be delayed. If he gets there, Leighton's waiting and is ready to sail. He doesn't want to be scurrying around trying to find an additional cask of biscuits, he says.
Right. So this is the old Jack Aubrey thing, right? There's not a moment to lose. And Stephen points out, clearly knows already, that the Surprise is not going to be going with the squadron to stay on the South African station. The Surprise is carrying dispatches for home. The Surprise's crew know this, and their joy is diminishing each day as they turn north, because they know they're heading to be paid off in time of peace. The Shelmerston men had been very unhappy with the idea and were wonderfully revived then when Jack said, well, I'm going to hire some of you guys on for the Surprise. And of course, he says, I can try and use some influence to ease the Surprise back into the service eventually, since the Navy is short of frigates. The Surprise can still be helpful. There's an upcoming mission to protect Indian and Chinese trade, and the Surprise will be well suited for that. And even if that doesn't work, Jack observes to Stephen that he can take his bargemen and a good many followers with him. The men who still remain on the Surprise, he says, well, they'll do okay, because there's plenty of openings and decent wages for sailors on merchant ships now that merchant trade is increasing at the end of the war. And here they are in Port Desire, and the local guy, the port captain, the sort of agent and general kind of boss man, recognizes that Stephen is at least a co-religionist, is Catholic, even if he identifies him as a member of the British party here, and therefore helps them to get fresh water and decent cabbages. And decent cabbages, which of us hasn't longed for a decent cabbage in life, Monk? And the lady who is the purveyor of the cabbages also has a spring. She's called Anita, and her spring, we learn, is the closest source of fresh water now that there's been flooding in the area inland and lots of kind of mud and filth has been washed down the river. Interestingly, Anita's sister, named Helena, is a werewolf. We get no further elaboration on this.
Right.
You can dig deep if you want to on the mythology of werewolves in South American culture, but it's just kind of planted there in the page. Yeah, she's a werewolf. Oh, she's a werewolf, says Stephen. Oh, interesting. Okay. She provides the cabbages, whereas her sister provided the water. Now, the rest of the town, like those also in the next port called Bahia Blanca, exhibit an attitude that's not so nice. In Stephen's words, he says it's the same sullen apathy, not unmingled with a reluctance to sell, exorbitant prices, and injurious expressions. So they're not being turned away, but it's not the warmest of welcomes either, right?
No, no, no. And, that night, I think this thing kind of carries over. Jack notes that Stephen's playing half a tone too high. And Stephen says, well, it's from the shrill bitterness of his soul. And Jack says, I'm really sorry. Let me get you a port. I've made you the emissary to all these wretched places inland. And he says, but of course, only too well that when you and all your people have been without long enough, you'll descend to the basest means to relieve your wants.
Mm.
And Stephen says, I'm not sure that the response is altogether civil. But be that as it may, I will tell you, Jack, that if they are bad in Port Desire and worse in Baja, they're likely to be downright outrageous in the River Plate, where we are to meet the South African ships. Yet, if I am not mistaken, we're likely to be there well before Lord Leighton, well before even your little squadron. So,
Ooh.
classic O'Brien, we're ratcheting the tension up, saying, okay. And we remember earlier they were saying part of this resentment in South America is about the English's earlier sacking of Buenos Aires. And here they're going to be right there at Buenos Aires.
Yep.
And so Stephen's trying to warn Jack, but unfortunately, Jack picks up on the wrong part of Stephen's warning.
He
Your
does.
little squadron.
His ear twitches about the little squadron thing, and he can't have his manhood impugned like that. Not so little, he says. 2 ships of the line, the Suffolk, a 50-gun ship, and Stephen goes, hush, hush, it's okay. I meant little as an endearment. A meliorative term, he says, as one says, my little puss, to a handsome Amazon that weighs 15 stone in her ship. However, Stephen again warns that if they arrive early because of Jack's commendable zeal, they might, while still need to be careful, they might need to moor in close to the southern shore, so out of the reach of the worst importunities of the shore-going Argentinians. Jack asks Stephen if he wouldn't feel better if they would just leave this port now and sail quietly for their River Plate. That would be great, says Stephen. I'd really appreciate it. There's not very much wildlife here. I could use some time afloat with Jacob to get my collections in order. And now, Mike, we get what we've all been longing for, which is one of these beautiful flowing O'Brien descriptions of life at sea. Do you want to give us a taste?
Oh, well, O'Brien describes it. He says, quietly, indeed, they sailed along with gentle breezes that wafted them generally northwards at something in the nature of 5 miles in the hour, northwards to even warmer seas. Little activity was called for apart from the nice adjustment of the sails, and although the exact routine of the ship was never relaxed, nor her very strict rules for cleanliness, these long sunny days with a soldier's wind seemed to many the ideal of a seaman's life. Regular, steady, traditional meals with the exact allowance of grog, hornpipes in the last dog watch, the deep melody of the doctor's cello from the cabin, and the cheerful sound of the gunroom's dinner. The future lost in a haze somewhat north of the equator. And we'll come back to this, Ian, where O'Brien's leaving us here in his writing of 21. This is one of these beautiful scenes.
It's great. And again, Mike, going back to what we said at the beginning, do you read this through thinking, oh, this is a poor old fella struggling? No, you read this through thinking, this is somebody for whom this is as natural as breathing. Anyhow, Jack's got a great first lieutenant, and with that support, he has days free to work with his clerk. He's got to gather all of his notes, his notebooks, and journals. The hydrographical department expects them all to be nicely formatted and presented. By the way, going back a book or two, Anson would have loved to have had these. if only we could have had time travel. He's working on these when the leading marks for the River Plate are sighted. So they're there. They pull into the bay. There's no sign of any other man of war. It's all suspiciously quiet. And back to another of our favorite themes, the fear of suffering and affront. Jack doesn't want to arrive and not receive a salute. So he sends Stephen and Jacob ashore, and we've seen this done before, sends them ashore to ask informally whether the surprise's salute will be returned. However, there's a boat with some medicos and a couple of dirty mates of the medicos pulling out from the very quiet shore toward them. Closer, this boat gets there, and the man on the boat hollers, quarantine. So he's come to inquire about the bill of health of the surprise here. His name, the doctor that is Dr. Quental. Stephen introduces himself in Latin to Dr. Quental as Quental comes aboard. And Dr. Quental says, do you speak Portuguese? Turns out no. So they continue in Latin. Do you have, and this is all written in Latin in the text, Mike, and I just read past these nice Latin plurals all expressed here. Fortunately, Anthony Gary Brown in the Guide for the Perplexed translates them for us. So Doctor is asking, do you have any of the following categories of illness? Skin eruptions, critical cases and symptoms, inflammations, pains, corpses, convulsions, men under restraint, vomiters, cripples, degenerates, and sodomites. And why you need the yellow Q flag before you certify yourself as free from degenerates and sodomites, I do not know. Anyhow, it's a funny moment. Meanwhile, this guy has to satisfy himself that the few invalids that there are don't represent a threat of infection. So Stephen takes him to see the invalids being looked after by Paul Skeeping and Maggie. Dr. Quental is very impressed by their condition. He's very impressed with how they've been treated, very impressed with a little gift that Stephen begs that he will accept, which is a beautiful French amputating saw. There's benign corruption there.
Right.
So Quental gives the ship a clean bill of health and tells them, thankfully, that the fort would return their salute exactly, and, says the text, having sorted his Latin with some care while he finished his glass. He told Stephen that he was an anti-clerical and that he had nothing to do with the public burning of heretics, and that he dared say that there were very good men everywhere, among Jews, for example, or blacks, or even worse. So he's giving a little warning here that says, I'm not prejudiced, but there are some people around here who are prejudiced against people like British Protestants who are even worse than blacks or Jews.
I wanted to point out that the notes here are assembled from both O'Brien's typed manuscript as well as his written pages. And there are lots of little indications where O'Brien says, I want to go back and I might want to switch this up when I type it. And in both of the editions, if you're looking at either, the original, the US, the UK, there are footnotes throughout where they're switching back and forth, like at this point. And we're not talking through all that. We're not going to try to do that. We're trying to tell the story as we pull that out. But for listeners and for readers, just wanted you to know about that. So the quarantine boat pulls away. O'Brien calls it a Rio boat, but they're in the waters off Buenos Aires. So I was trying to figure out if Rio is a type of boat. Don't know. And Wantage, remember Wantage, we'll come back to him, tells Stephen one of the boat's mates said that some people from a bark out of Boston last night had caused an upset on the shore, saying that the Bible allowed more than one wife and denouncing the Pope. A fight had broken out. 5 Protestant houses in the town were burned, and that it might get worse tonight after the Pope's legate, that is the Pope's ambassador, someone, who has the full power to act on the Pope's behalf, arrives. And Jack says he hopes this is not true. Jack says this is the very last moment to become religious and to start looking for stakes and gunpowder and what do you call those things? San Benitos, says Stephen. Just so, San Benitos. All we want to do is to fill up our water, buy some fresh provisions, and no doubt some wholesome fruit. We do not want to be racked, scourged, and burnt. We get plenty of that at sea, free, gratis, and for nothing, and pay our compliment to the governor. That's all we want to do. Oh, that Suffolk would come in, followed by the rest of the Blue Squadron, then by Lord Leighton and his ships, and hey for Cape Town, with never a papist in sight for the next 10,000 miles. Oh, I beg pardon, dear Stephen, he added, looking earnestly into Stephen's face. I really did not mean to be unkind or personal. I'm sure you did not, my dear, said Stephen. Here, even 21 books in, Jack still inserts foot in mouth occasionally with Stephen. But we are, as you said, the tension is ratcheting up about this turbulence and perhaps faith issues and English and Argentinian everything. This San Benito that was mentioned, a penitential garment worn during the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. It looks sort of like a monk's habit, but on these, this was worn by people as the sentence was pronounced by the Inquisition. And they were either colored yellow and red crosses for a penitent heretic, or black with painted devils and flames for impenitent heretics. I couldn't help but think of, the yellow stars of World War II and some things like that. This is not something that you want. But it's interesting. So we have this San Benito, another reference beautifully done. But some of you, Ian, are probably wondering about wattage, right? Wantage?
Right.
Hold on. Don't we remember this character Wantage from Blue at the Mizzen?
Yeah, he was the master's mate. When they were at Funchal in Blue at the Mizzen, he had not answered the Blue Peter. He hadn't boarded the ship, was thought to be dead. Later rejoined the Surprise, having been emasculated and held in the hills there for sleeping with a shepherdess. He had been bullied by a gentleman midshipman and then surprisingly died of yellow fever and buried overboard in chapter 6. Pretty definitely a Norwegian Blue at this point, is poor old Wantage. So we were surprised also to see that he's back to life. Perhaps O'Brien liked him, or perhaps he just liked the name. Anyhow, there he is, Wantage again, risen. So Jack and Stephen have tea together on the ship, and we remember them taking tea together, right? I mean, not very often, not since the goat milk episode in Master and Commander have I remembered them actually taking tea. But here we go. Jack, it turns out, takes tea seriously, just as well he might, being so much exposed to the elements. And again, might we ask ourselves, Jack Aubrey liking tea, is that kind of deliberately conjoined here with Wantage coming back from the dead? I don't. Anyhow, they're having a little chat here. Jack is trying to talk to Stephen about taking the ship's Catholics ashore, but he doesn't quite know how to word it. And he says he doesn't know how to say it without offending papists, Romans, people of the old faith, all these different euphemisms. And Matchery cuts in dead and says, the word Catholics is in general use in Ireland. Okay, thanks, Stephen. Jack is hoping that if Stephen takes his Catholics to the cathedral, and if they are well behaved and, presentable enough to fit to pass an admiral's inspection, their presence might persuade His Holiness, this legate who's due to arrive, that we are not all a band of gin-sodden rapparees given over entirely to whoredom and things that I do not even like to mention. So he's kind of asking Stephen and the ship's token Catholics to go and kind of do the good deed here. And Jack isn't sure whether Stephen's going to think this is an okay thing. What actual result do we get from Stephen?
Well, Stephen actually thinks it is a good idea. He says he's going to tell the crew members that he takes with him, mostly the Irish Catholics there, that this is for the honor of the ship, that we should not be blackened with a whole number of brushes. Lutherans, bigots, church burners, destroyers of monasteries, sodomites, and a great number of other words that will instantly occur to your mind. Having grown up Lutheran, I thank you, Stephen, right? But Stephen says, before I do that, I want to go ashore and gather some intelligence about why people here, in Stephen's word, do not love us as much as they should. So I love this. Again, this is, like you said, Ian, this is great writing, and this is O'Brien to a T.
Great stuff. Here we get the truth of the reception for these British arrivals. Early in the morning, while Stephen's gone, a large scow full of the city's, what he calls, night soil, the sewage, the human waste of the city for the night, throws its load of shit, for want of a better word, into the water right next to the Surprise, fouling her yardarms. I can't imagine how this stuff is splashed up so that the Surprise's yardarms are fouled. Anyway, the sailors cry out, filthy sods. Incoming boats throw even more disgusting waste at the Surprise. And Stephen and Joseph return aboard ship looking like foreigners. They've clearly gone trying to blend in. The extreme clerical element, what Stephen actually calls the right-wing element, here in Buenos Aires, has got a plan to overthrow the governor and the government tonight or tomorrow. The legate has great influence with the service population and their leaders, and he's here to prevent or soften this movement. So I think we were fearing that the legate might drive the whole city to an even more conservatively religious standpoint. It turns out that he's actually here to be a bit more of a moderate. The ultra-clericals who are in the town have little armed support. Therefore, they've made such a big deal of this Protestant business and pelting the ship we've done. That's their way of making their gesture on their terms, maybe before the legate arrives to put more of a dignified front on everything. Stephen invites Jack to come on deck and watch the legate because he's here. He's about to bless the fishermen and the fishing boats on this, which is a holy day of obligation. And Mike, I absolutely love this moment. Worth the price of entry. What do we see as we see the legate arriving to do the blessing of the fishing boats and all that?
Yeah, the crowd goes silent. These trumpets sound. And the legate, who O'Brien describes as a fine, tall, upright figure in a white gown, goes to the head of the steps. Jack, standing there watching with Stephen, cries, "By God, he's black." Just before Jack's face contorts with emotion. And Stephen says to Jack, "He is very happy," murmured Stephen. "Presently, he will come over." And I'm going, what? What? When the ceremony ends and the legate tells everyone they may now sail with God, the silent crowd watches as the legate's splendid barge pulls over to the Surprise. And the legate, O'Brien writes, came up the side like a right seaman and hurried across the deck to his father. Getting choked up again here. Dearest Sam, you have not changed, said Jack as they clasped hands. Then Sam knelt and patted his father's feet, a gesture as natural as the sun. And Ian, I think both of us were saying, this goes down as another one of our favorite canon moments.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I couldn't give a rat's that he's here to quell the unrest in the city. I don't care about the plot bit. I just care about him in his character as Jack's son and all of the associations that brings for us with the Jack's history and his personality. It's just, it's great. Jack needed a moment to regain his composure, just as we all do. O'Brien tells us now that this was news to a few of the men who were on board the Surprise. They noticed that Jack and the nuncio, Jack and the legate, looked so much alike. And of course, we know, just in case you're listening to this and you didn't get this part in our earlier discussion of the canon, the legate is Sam Panda, who is Jack's natural son from his time as a midshipman on the South African station. Everyone on the Surprise lives closely together, so closely that they know pretty much everything about each other. And there's a really beautiful tribute. O'Brien says that Killick was a reliable source of information. And where did he get it? His information about Jack and his character. Much of it, says the text, derived from Barrett Bondon. Rest in peace, Barrett Bondon. Barrett Bondon, Jack's coxswain and valued friend until he was killed in battle, a source of much greater value. And I know there were some of us who felt bad about the rather kind of short way that the death of Bondon was dealt with a couple of books ago. But it's really great that we get reminded that Bondon was like close to Jack's heart and was a really, really close part of the sort of Jack Aubrey follower family, if you like, even more so than Killick. And this is a chance for us all to get caught up on the exposition side of things as well. We hear about how Sam had been Jack's illegitimate son, how Stephen had managed to get Sam a disposition to help him rise through the Catholic Church, how the church wanted to give more attention to the rapidly increasing world of black people and people of African origin. Sam, black and a great linguist and a smart guy and a predominant Catholic, had done great work in Brazil and is now here in Argentina bringing greetings and good advice for those about to be in power. So, Mike, I'm so happy that this came where it did. It came at the end of chapter 1, because reading this for the first time, I thought, yes, this is a real O'Brien book. This has got real character stuff in that we love. So, it's the first chapter of a Patrick O'Brien book. We often wonder as we turn the page, are we then going to get transported to 6 months ahead to the other side of the world, or are we in the same moment just a few seconds later? Which of those is it at the beginning of chapter 2?
We turn the page to chapter 2 and Jack's exclaiming, "That was a damned good dinner." And I'm thinking, oh, not exactly what you want to say in the Pope's representative's dinner. But it was not actually the dinner with Sam, which was also a damn good dinner. But thankfully, Jack didn't say it there. But it's after the governor's dinner in honor of His Excellency, the most revered Dr. Samuel Mupta. He had kept his mother's name, writes O'Brien,
Yeah.
papal nuncio to the Republic of the Argentine. So, here is, we just had this beautiful, incredible sailing. We have our heroes doing well. And now we learn that Jack's first son has done phenomenally well, with the whole, kind of everything in his background sort of against him in a way. He's done great. And Sam and his allies, we learned, had recently saved the Republic's government when many influential moderates and their black followers had defected from the people about to break into open rebellion and had disclosed the location of the rebellion's arsenals to the people in power. So Sam's really, he's a power broker in Argentina here. And it sounds similar. He's very much like his dad. He's also very much like Stephen in his politics and his diplomacy and his, the way he's doing it, which is a fascinating thing. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh. So if this book continues, if the series continues, where might we see Sam again? I'm loving this.
Yeah. Now they're on the way down the steps, the really, really rather challenging, tricky, slippery steps. A small ship's boy comes up and distracts Jack with a message. The squadron is in the gut, just stemming the tide. This is the squadron with Admiral Lord Leighton and the Suffolk and all of the ships, among which Jack is about to be finally announced in post as an admiral. Jack is taken aback to the extent that he slips on the steps. He's looking into the harbour as he kind of looks over. He falls into the arms of Sam and Awkward Davis. Fortunately, the great big lumbering, tree trunk of Awkward Davis is there to catch them both and save them from harm. Jack then wishes Sam a good night's sleep and heads off for the ship, where they're all up through the night watching for the main squadron, watching for Lord Leighton to come in. They know that they're going to encounter a squadron with a admiral aboard. They know that this is in effect a big inspection. They've been at sea for a while and they've seen some weather, so they're working really, really hard to get the ship and their persons ready for inspection. Killick has been worrying over Jack's Rear Admiral's uniform, but this is the same uniform that he had when he was a Commodore, albeit it now gets some extra decoration. It's looking, though, pretty old and threadbare, and Killick moans to Jack a little bit about this, and Jack says, don't worry, we have the ribbon of the bath to set off the old coat. This is another little thing that O'Brien's dropped in there. He's done this before. He's temporarily awarded Jack ribbons of chivalric knighthood orders in the past, and it turns out to have been a bit of a red herring. If Jack has anything to do with the Order of the Bath at this point, it can't be because he's been made a Knight of the Bath, because if that were the case, he would be Sir Jack or Sir John, and people would be talking to him in exactly that way. He could be a Companion of the Bath, which is a kind of first step on the order. Knights of the Bath, the Order of the Bath was set up in the 18th century as an order for awards and honours for people in military service and naval service. So the ribbon of the Bath is a beautiful scarlet purple ribbon with a little medal, the badge of the order on it, worn at the collar and still worn to this day by people who are companions of the Bath. Anyhow, while Jack is prettying himself, a boat launches from the Suffolk, comes across very handsomely, kissing alongside, and aboard comes Captain Simmons. He's got mail for Jack. Jack is very happy to see him again. We think that this might be the same Simmons who was a lieutenant on the Lively back in Post Captain, but who knows? They're not talking about that bit of shared history, right? They're talking about their time together on Pegasus. And Jack tells this Simmons, whichever one it is, that he'll come over to Suffolk at about 4 bells. So he's going to give everybody time to get ready before the ceremonial comes of Jack hoisting his flag.
Before Jack goes across looking grave, he meets the officers. His flag is raised and greeted by 13 solemn guns. There are salutes from all over the Blue Squadron and a distant cheer from the Surprise, as well as, O'Brien writes, clouds of wheeling discontented gulls with all this firing going on here. Well, Simmons shows Jack around the ship, and Jack asks if the Admiral still sails with a flag captain. Simmons says he does, but both Captain Fielding and he, Simmons being the other flag captain, if you will, or would have been Jack's flag captain, are going home on the Surprise if there's room. And Jack's like, ooh, ooh, well, I'm only asking because I want to know where to direct my less important questions so as not to bother the admiral. He's kind of thinking, oh, I don't want it reported back that I was being presumptuous. If the admiral's not going to have a flag captain, I won't either here. So Jack doesn't kind of get an answer. He starts to ask some of these questions to Simmons, but a purser's clerk who's curious about the new captain comes up and very, kind of with less discipline than one would see on a ship like that, is asking Jack all these questions about watering. So not only is Jack not going to have a flag captain, it looks like everybody's going to feel free to approach him here a little bit. Well, in his long inspection around the ship, Jack notes that the officer seems seaman-like, but he has a general impression of anxiety and overwork. Like, note to self, let's see if this turns out to be something that comes back. He does get to see the ship's 24-pounders all equipped with shining Douglas sights. So, some kind of better armament here. And at the end of the tour, Jack asks Simmons if he finds the ship hard to work in really heavy weather with so small a company. I think Jack has been looking around going, whoa, we're really short on hands here. And Simmons says he has, and he assures Jack that he's heard all about it. And this phrase, heard all about it, Ian, I took that to mean that the admiral's been chewing him out, that he hasn't done well. But, Simmons is more focused on that than he is the fact that they're drastically undermanned. Well, they're interrupted by a call from the masthead that the rear admiral is desired to go aboard the flag. So Jack borrows Simmons' graciously offered tarpaulin jacket for the wet pool as he's going to go over in this boat right into the wind on some pretty choppy seas.
So, aboard the flagship, the admiral looks at Jack with what O'Brien calls a certain satisfaction. He tells Jack, you should have worn an oilskin. And I'm transported straight back to Hart, and any number of other admirals have always liked to find some way to needle this rather insubordinate guy, Jack Aubrey. Still, he says, we cannot all be wise all the time. Ay, ay, ay. The admiral says he's called Jack over because they're low of supplies, particularly on tobacco. They haven't been able to buy stuff from the locals on the way down. He wonders to himself, and hoping for Jack's advice here, what's it like in Buenos Aires? Should we push on? And he's kind of aware that things with the present ministry, the present government in Argentina, are a little bit shaky. Jack says, well, we were having a hard time until the papal nuncio arrived. Someone, and he's being very modest here, someone well known to my political advisor, Dr. Maturin. Ah, yes, says the Admiral, I remember him. We'll pay him some attention. Now, says Jack, you can buy everything you like at moderate prices. Things have calmed down a lot. Jack and the Surprise are provisioned for the Cape. The Surprise is ready for the voyage home with dispatches. And Lord Leighton says that's a relief, but his face tells another message. He looks discontented, querulous, ready to find fault or to contradict. And it turns out that finding fault and contradiction isn't the only thing on Leighton's mind. He's got a command that he tries to give to Jack. I want, he says, to send 2 officers and an unsatisfactory midshipman home in the Surprise. But, says Jack, the Surprise is not mine. She's not a ship under Admiralty command. Her contract with the Admiralty came to an end with me hoisting my flag. It's completely up to her owner whether he chooses to take these people aboard. And this gets us a bit of an intemperate outburst from the Admiral, who's not used to having his words contradicted. What a damned hair-splitting sea lawyer you are, upon my word, Aubrey, cried the Admiral. You can damn well go back to that half-baked privateerly donkey frigate and give the owner my orders to take these 2 officers and the reefer aboard. If he makes the slightest demur or objection, tell him that I shall press every man in his ship and leave him to wallow in the mud of the River Plate until she rots. At this point, says O'Brien, the Admiral's yellow face had a curious flush, and his eyes fairly blazed. One clenched fist rose and fell. And Mike, we're no longer in any doubt. Definitely, we have another Admiral Hart case here. What can Jack do about this? And when it comes to it, how will Stephen respond? And now we have Jack's reply, Mike. And what are we meant to make of this?
Well, it's fascinating. Jack repeats the slightest demur or objection. shall press every man. And as Jack's saying this, he's getting up and putting on his tarpaulin to leave. And the admiral says, no, sit down, have a drink of Madeira with me. And you and I were both talking about this, like, okay, so oh God, I'd love, this is one of those ones I want to see. How would they do this on the TV show? How do they do this in the movie?
Yeah.
Is Jack really pissed off here? Is he angry and defiant? Is he cold and formal? Is he like, okay, so is he thinking about Steven's reptilian eyes? And who knows exactly what he's doing here. But the admiral, in the meantime, thinks a little bit better of it. He's remembering that the doctor, who is the owner of this thing, had treated Prince William and is well with his highness, the current king. He suggests that Jack tell Stephen that he would take it as a personal favor if the doctor would allow these people aboard his ship. So he's got to recalibrating here. And the admiral adds that he would also be very obliged to Jack for carrying this message and helping to persuade, the doctor. And he invites Jack to dinner the next night and asks him to bring the doctor along. He also asks if the doctor will be going home in the Surprise. And Jack says, well, he doesn't know. But Stephen and Dr. Jacobs have many more duties waiting for them in South Africa or eastwards. He's saying this is a strong possibility. So it's interesting because usually we don't hear, I guess now we're at the admiral level, we'll hear more about the politics being discussed openly by these sea officers here. But Jack says he is going to go back to Surprise to transfer some of the hands there to the poor, thin Suffolk. And the admiral says, in fact, the Suffolk was hit with the Yellowjack off Port of Spain. So it's interesting. I think Jack's working out a deal here in his own mind that we'll hear a little bit more about. Yeah.
And smart of the admiral to read the situation and to step back a little bit from his anger. Smart of Jack Aubrey as well to kind of stay cool and not start to throw his weight around. Plenty of time for that later in the book, though. Let's see. Jack goes back to the Surprise and he finds Stephen reading the mail with a grave face. Jack, even so, delivers the dinner invitation from the admiral and asks Stephen to sort through Jack's own mail. All hands are called aboard the Surprise, and there's a nice little moment of ceremony, a little bit of pathos as well. He says, this is the point where formally Jack Aubrey and the Surprise part company for a while. He knows, though, that they're uneasy about being thrown ashore in peacetime. He says he can take 63 prime hands to the Suffolk, which is pretty generous, but that's partly because the Suffolk's been decimated by the disease. His clerk will take the names of volunteers and he'll select the men. I love this. He'll select the men most suited to the South African climate, which is a very nice way of saying, I'll select the men, but not for reasons that you're going to be able to argue over. Very, very diplomatic. He then goes and picks up his letters from Stephen, who still is reading through his own mail. And O'Brien catches us up through some of the letter writing and through some of the kind of lightheartedness about Sophie and how hard it is to decode the order of her letters. We get a bit of background about Sophie before we get into this series of undated, rather scrambled up letters. Both of Jack's estates, we learn quickly, are doing well. All of Jack's children are as well as can be expected. And despite being unable to make out the completely correct history and sequence of these letters, Jack is getting the distinct impression that there had been and that there still is some kind of grave unhappiness going on at Woolcombe. And Mike, I first read this and again thought back to Yellow Admiral and Blue at the Mizzen and what's Sophie discovered, what's she now thinking and feeling about her husband. It's not that, at least not yet. It's family that's the problem. Stephen feels his gaze but doesn't want to get into a subject that actually concerns Jack more than it concerns him. Jack finally says, with all of the coming aboard, the hoisting his flag, and his disagreement with Lord Leighton, he's feeling uncommonly stupid. Would you mind telling me what you understand about what's afoot at home? Very lovely moment of friendship between the two of them. So he gets to learn what's really going on from Stephen, who A, gets better intelligence in his letters from Christine, who's more organized, and B, is a bit more of a student of human nature, I think.
Well, Stephen reminds Jack that Christine had gone to stay with Sophie and Bridget at Woolcombe, and that Jack's daughters were away at school for most of that time. Jack's son George was also there for a long while his ship was being refitted, and that Bridget and George had gotten along very well, often riding together, and that Christine's brother, who had brought them up, so loved that countryside that he rented a comfortable, fair-sized house a quarter-mile away, Mendenham. And you pointed out Mendenham, last week. This is the estate we found Jack Byron in the opening scene of The Unknown Shore.
Yeah.
Well, everything looks lovely at Mendenham, except there's this jealous neighbor who we'll find more about later, who had wanted it the whole time and files this long, convoluted legal mineral rights claim that allows him uninterrupted access to Edward's land. So Edward has to run off. Christine and Bridget continue to stay with Sophie. Jack's twin girls arrive home, and they are very jealous of Bridget and the attention she's receiving from Sophie. So much so that Christine takes Bridget off to the new house even before her brother Edward arrives back. He's up north trying to deal with lawyers and figure this all out. So that's not going well. And Sophie, on her side, is really worried that she and Christine may quarrel because her twins are being particularly unkind. So we've got Stephen explaining this situation. Meanwhile, Jack's now making more sense about what he's reading from Sophie. She writes, I know that she is particularly anxious to escape the attentions, the very pronounced attentions of Captain Miller. So it turns out that Captain Miller is this neighbor who's suing, but he's also there. He's this guy who is very interested in Christine, and Sophie's worried because Christine's over there without her brother there. This Miller's pursuing her. So we've got this whole thing about the twins' jealousy, this guy Miller, all of this that's going on at home.
Yeah. So we've got jealousy between the children. We've got unwelcome attention from a suitor. This is all feeling pretty uncomfortable. By the way, the Medmenham is fictitious, and exactly, Mike, this came up at the beginning of The Unknown Shore. Jack asks Stephen, who is this Captain Miller? What ship does he have? And Stephen says, no, he's not a naval captain. He's a military man. He has a moderate estate the other side of Caxley. He's vain and conceited. His regiment had once been posted to Sierra Leone, which is how he'd come across and decided to take a fancy to Christine. And it's funny, Caxley is another fictitious name, but it's a fictitious place name borrowed from another author. This might be the fictional town of Caxley, written about in a book called The Caxley Chronicles by an author pseudonymously known as Miss Reed. Anyhow, you can dig into Miss Reed if you like. It's quite a cute little kind of parallel story with Patrick O'Brien. With all of this going on at home, Jack now tells Stephen about the Admiral's request to send these two officers home in the Surprise. He says, kind of apologetically, I've pledged your word in exchange for the chance to get 63 hands from the Surprise berths on the Suffolk, since she can barely win her anchors with the men that she's currently got. And before they can get into the conversation about this, they get interrupted with an intervention that tells us that we're still very much at home with Patrick O'Brien. It's Killick. Whittles is up, said Killick, and the scent of toasted cheese wafted in with him. We love a bit of toasted cheese smell. They ate in silence, intently, hungrily. And then, resting his fork, Jack said, I have had what I think is an idea worthy of Newton. But during the night, I must spend the rest of my time reading the rest of my letters, and unless they contradict me, I shall tell you at breakfast. For once that is eaten, Surprise must make sail. And Mike, it's a really great end to chapter 2.
It was a great end. Great end to chapter 2. Maybe, you know what, we're about to jump into chapter 3, the final chapter, which is typed manuscript and then handwritten. And we're going to try to help get you through all of that. But let's take a break. Let's have the refreshment of your choice, and we'll be right back.
So, welcome back for one last time. It's really great to have you with us. This has been such a journey already, 2 chapters in, right, Mike? And
Right.
we can see the fewer and fewer pages ahead of us here. Like I've got the physical book in front of me, like I said, and I've got the typescript pages and the manuscript pages. And flipping ahead here, I can see that we've got more manuscript and progressively less typescript. Let's see where this takes us. For now, we're still in typescript, something that has been edited and that was laid down as at least a decent first draft. It's the morning now, and Stephen reports to Jack that he had written a very harsh directive that Bridget ought to be delivered into the hands of the letters carrier that was meant to be delivered by the Surprise or the Ringle, in turn into the hands of her father, and further a note to Christine and her brother, inviting them to join them. So he's basically said, everybody come.
Yes.
And Jack says, well, I too had written to Sophie asking her to bring the girls. And Jack does an even better job, I think, of reporting his naval kind of requesting and requiring minimum of implements, he says, is what they need to bring. Join them with the utmost dispatch. Yeah, maybe this is them talking about how they wish that they had written to their spouses, or maybe this is how they really did write to their spouses. Anyway, it sets this tone that, like, it's all going to be great. We're going to have the girls here. And Mike, I'm also thinking about the end of Persuasion, right? Where the heroine ends up on the deck of the ship with her hero, the captain, and thinking, oh, this is going to be one of those moments. I'm looking forward to this.
Nice. Well, they invite Harding in, and they confirm that Harding is to carry the Surprise and the Ringle home to Portsmouth with all possible speed, touching at Shelmerston, and delivering a certain number of officers to the commander-in-chief. So we're going to accommodate the admiral here. And after he takes Jack's letters to Sophie and Stephen's letter to Christine and her brother, he's to bring the 2 ladies, Sophie and Christine, Mrs. Wood's brother, and the 3 children. So Jack's 2 girls and Bridget, and a minimum number of attendants. So back to minimum implements, minimum number of attendants, back to the Cape to join the squadron on whichever vessel Harding chooses. So he can come back in the Surprise, come back in the Ringle, up to him. Well, Harding reads through the letters and suggests that they come back in the Ringle. He tells him, it's not as comfortable, but it is faster. And then O'Brien writes, this is Harding saying, and if I may be so bold, Miss Bridget loved it purely last time. She was afloat in a blow. Anyhow, you would want the Ringle as a tender, sir. Ah, Jack says, very true. So you think all these people will be crammed in? Well, says Harding, I should take my Davy on it, sir. So Harding takes his leave, wishes Suffolk a happy, prosperous voyage, and hopes the doctor and his mate, meaning Dr. Jacob, hopes that they bag a brace or 2 of phoenixes. So with your naturalizing, I hope you run across some phoenixes there. So his Davy, his affidavit, they'll crammed in, but they'll be okay. It'll be great.
Good. But we're going to kind of noodle with this choice about Ringle or Surprise for a little while longer, it turns out.
Right.
And I really liked remembering how much Bridget had enjoyed being aboard the Ringle. What was it, a couple of books ago?
Right.
And Jack says, well, I agree with Harding. Passengers won't always lie at their ease in the Ringle. And Stephen's reflecting that Harding might have made that choice in order that he can command Jack's tender to sail back to the imposing Great Suffolk when he returns. And everybody's very impressed with their handling and the speed of the Ringle. And Harding quite fancies himself that little mission there. Stephen would like to hear Jack's notion that he had described earlier as being worthy of Newton. No, says Jack, you go first. Your notion will no doubt be more luminous. And they're kind of egging each other on here. It's great. Stephen says Jack has no idea of the fundamental difference between a mere lubber and a seaman, and he'd had no idea of this difference since he went to sea as a child. Jack, hasn't seen the way that lubbers look at sailors on the tossing deck. And this is Stephen now describing the view, how a seaman looks to a lubber like him. The gaze almost instantly followed by a feeling of unavoidable and certain death, cold death, followed by furious, uncontrollable heaves and shameless vomiting, morbid frigor and despair. And he describes the sailors in the view of such lubbers being godlike creatures stalking about the nightmare deck, and that this whole situation reduces mere lubbers to a state of laudable and permanent humility. Oh my God. I love the fact that Stephen is gently calling out that not everybody is as fluent and has the sea legs of Bridget. But meanwhile, I think reducing lubbers to a state of laudable and permanent humility, that's been a good exercise. That's been our mission for 220 episodes, right? To
There
reduce
you go.
ourselves to
Absolutely.
laudable and permanent humility. Not sure how successful we've been. But Stephen continues, no, my good sir. You may say what you please, but there is a great gulf fixed between the landlubber who comes late to things that float, and the true-born seaman. A gulf as great as that between a sheep and a seal. And Jack's very sanguine about this. He says, well, very true. Said Jack, who had the training of some of the sheep. Meaning, Jack had been responsible for taking care of a few lubbers. In fact, every ship he's ever led, Jack has had to fashion a few lubbers into seamen or seawomen. So we get back to talking now, back from lubbers in general, back to Bridget, right?
Yeah, Stephen says, and he's been saying this to make the point. He says, Bridget was baptized in seawater. She rejoices in boats when ashore and in heavy sea when afloat. She loves being sprayed, is nimble in the rigging, the darling of the upper yardmen. She understands the rigging better than I do, says Stephen. And I think he's weakening his argument a little bit in this. But he does add that even the old hands respect her knowledge. And then O'Brien writes, this is Stephen talking, no, my dear Jack, what I should have said had you not in essence said it before me was that one, however young, who has sea legs, sea sense, and a knowledge both acquired and to some degree, as it were, instinctive of the sea's very nature itself, bears down all frippery land-based experience, however old. And so, boy, Stephen making quite the case here, sort of saying, this thing between Bridget and Jack's girls is not going to be resolved because all the twins, though older, have is frippery land-based experience as opposed to Bridget. So he's saying, don't worry, when they come back here on the ship, this whole thing will be resolved between Bridget and the twins.
Right. That's a high hope. I think we would all want to have
right.
That. And it's quite a complex argument, and Jack, bless him, is a bit of a simplistic soul. He misses the point. My daughters aren't that old, he says. Oh, come, Stephen. And I love this moment. Oh, come, Stephen. Charlotte and what's her name are not exactly crones. As I remember, they only date from the Mauritius campaign. So I love that, A, he can't remember his kids' names. And B, right. he doesn't know how old they are, really, but he knows that they were born around the time of the Mauritius campaign.
Right.
Very good. Mike, you and I both know that to be justified in forgetting kids' names, you need to be promoted a step further. Right? He needs to be a grandfather to aspire to that plane.
Too true. Well, right.
Stephen then corrects Jack. The age is not the issue, and he finishes off with his solution to the problems about separating the girls. They might have been born with Helen of Troy, as far as that is concerned. Aboard, particularly aboard so lithe and eager a vessel as the Ringle, Bridget must bear them down, and a just equilibrium will be reached with mutual respect and no bullying. And Stephen's always had high ideals about the ideal state of society, and he's been a bit of a utopian. And I wonder whether he's not reaching for a bit of the utopia here. Yeah, right. Merit, he thinks, is going to win out once Bridget is at sea, and there's going to be no more jealousy, no more bullying between three girls who've fallen out lately. Stephen.
Ouch. Well, Lord Leighton's flagship is still having its mainmast repaired, and so Jack and Stephen are taking every opportunity to kind of climb up above the harbor so Stephen can observe birds and insects, and he notes the bizarre mating habits of a colony of variegated scorpions. I thought, oh gosh, this has got to be a thing. Now, I sadly couldn't find anything about South American variegated scorpion behavior specifically, but in general, apparently male scorpions lead females on this kind of dance-like walk, holding her by her large claws. And during this waltz, males have been observed stinging their partners, kind of we're flipping around on the old master and commander praying mantis scene here. Nobody's ever figured out if the male injects venom or if it's a dry sting, That is kind of a pre-venom made up of salts used as a little bit of a painful defense, or a full venom, which of course can paralyze and kill them. And people argue back and forth about this. Stephen, I suspect, would have found out. Other people say, well, maybe part of this is calming the female, stunning her a little bit, allowing the male to lead her, because the male scorpion puts his sperm package on the ground and she has to absorb that into her body, which needs some choreography, hence this dancing motion over the top. Some think perhaps the stings make her receptive to the dance without becoming aggressive or running away, because this female could just as easily take the male on in this thing as well. However, some scientists think the opposite, that the male sting has a stimulatory role instead, comparing it to similar behavior by centipedes. And, I can only imagine that Stephen and Patrick O'Brien would probably be acquainted with some of this. All new news to me.
Wow. Thank you, Mike. Really, really great digging there. This isn't the last time in this chapter that we're going to talk about the metaphor of the sting or the stabbing wound or the blade. So let's kind of hold on to that for a second. It's also not the first time we've had it in the canon either. Anyway, sex is a deathly dance is a theme that we had a lot, and here it is again. Meanwhile, aboard the Suffolk, everyone is ready to go. It's been ready to go for a while now. There's a wardroom full of reasonably experienced, intelligent officers. There are gun crews who Jack is finding are just as brisk as he could want them, at least in dumb show, rattling the guns in and out. It all seems to be looking good. The small arms men are in good form. She's packed with prime salt beef from local ranchers. She's got army biscuit that the crew are finding agreeable, industrial quantities of tobacco, and boats still coming out to the ship every day from the shore with butcher stalls, with fresh fruits, with vegetables. Mike, you and I were on unknown shore just a few chapters ago. This is a complete change, right? There's
for sure
here. And if the book had continued, I wonder if this is going to be a theme. I wonder if reaching past chapter 3, we were going to get, a problem with provisions. But he's really drawing our attention to the lavish, cornucopia of supplies that are available to the Suffolk and to the rest of the fleet. One little warning: when is Jack going to leave? On Friday.
Ooh.
On Friday, Jack leaves the ship in the hands of the first lieutenant, because they're sailing without a flag captain, so the first lieutenant is all there is. And Jack invites Stephen to climb higher than usual and to bring a telescope. They climb up on this Friday to a high point in a purplish red landscape with vicious cactus around them. And Jack sits and says he's longing for the green of Woolcombe Downs. So a little bit of nostalgia. Quite unusual for Jack to be longing for home when he's aboard a ship. Normally, as we know, things are the other way around. He really misses the idea of the childhood with hounds and horses. He misses that he could have been spending the peace teaching George, his son, how to hunt. However, he says, like he always does, he's very lucky with his lot. He's very lucky to have his flag, but still, he says he longs to be back home. Stephen now asks, amidst all of this nostalgia, haven't you seen the small vessel out there on the sea with its sails all in line? And of course, Jack looks through a telescope and says, yes, that's the Ringle. And Stephen would really like to see Christine and Bridget and Edward. And I think he thinks he does, and he would like to believe that the tiny figures that he can see might be those three clinging to a spar. And looking back at Jack, Stephen can't believe how fast his very stout and tall friend is now moving. Jack isn't waiting around because he knows that whoever's clinging to the spar, one of the people aboard that ship, is Sophie, and that's who he's been longing for.
Nice. Well, Stephen goes aboard and he hears the Aubrey twins, the girls, shouting for the 7th time, why are you not wearing your admiral's uniform? So, hey, Dad, haven't seen you in years. How are you? Love you. So good to see you. Bridget, on the other hand, finds Stephen and whispers, dearest papa, as he bends down to kiss her. A great little contrast here. And Stephen looks at Christine's smiling face and tells her that Bridget does her infinite credit before he greets Edward, her brother. This was just, this just got me. I love that, the whole thing there.
I love it. one of our sort of questions in our mind about the whole arc is Stephen and Christine, and
Yes.
how close are they going to get to a real romantic relationship? And I was like reading this, hoping that there might, a glance or some little unsaid bit of kind of contact between them. She's very happy to be there, and she's very happy being the kind of temporary step godmother aunt to Bridget. But I'm not getting Diana Villiers, delight in each other's presence vibes here. But who knows? Anyhow, everyone is amazed, they say, having been aboard the Ringle, and lubbers and people with sea legs alike. They've been aboard the Ringle with some fairly confined quarters there, so they're amazed at the size of the visitor cabins aboard the Suffolk. Stephen sees that Bridget's nautical experience has struck some kind of a balance with the Aubrey twins, who, as we had pointed out previously, didn't in fact know the difference between a ship and a schooner, had, as predicted, been seasick almost the entire time, never really got their sea legs, and it seems like some of this kind of restitution of the social balance has actually taken place. Bridget, meanwhile, quickly gets with all of the old surprise seamen that she knows really well, which put her in the social hierarchy even above Mrs. Aubrey, but amongst all the other passengers, and she was accompanied by Padine. And Mike, I gave a big yay
Right.
half a chapter ago when we had Sam. I get at least a medium-sized yay for having Padine back with us. We last saw him ashore as the sort of retainer of the Matcher and Villiers family, but here he is. He's with the girls, and he is seen by the rest of the crew as an old surprise of remarkable standing and authority, and I'm really happy that he's with us.
Yeah. Well, despite their poor start on the Ringle, the twins, Jack's girls, quickly adapt to life on the Suffolk, and Stephen is glad to see that Bridget seems to be completely at home with everyone here, not like, as O'Brien writes, a friend's child accepted for that friend's sake. So she really does feel at home here rather than somebody's being kept. And O'Brien tells us as soon as the twins were peaceable, Bridget becomes kind and companion-like. So, a little domestic tranquility there with the kids. And Sophie, we finally see Sophie. I was like, hey, come on, when is Sophie going to show up here? Sophie tells Stephen how glad she is that their daughters are friends again. She'd thought about whipping her girls, but remembered that it only made her more dogged when she was young. And Christine says she can't imagine Sophie being whipped. And Sophie tells her all about it. So we hear a little bit of that experience. Stephen had thought whipping children was something only Catholics did. And he points out that Jack himself discourages flogging. So quite the little discussion here.
And we're getting a sort of very dispassionate, detached thing from Jack and Stephen towards their kids. Jack can't remember their names. Stephen is talking quite offhand about, would you flog your kids? Oh, I don't know. Maybe you would, maybe not so much. And again, I'm thinking of O'Brien, in his very, very, very late years, thinking about his relationship with his kids. And he can delight in the fact that families are together. And clearly there's some genuine joy in the writing as the families are together, but also a bit of the sort of curmudgeonly, well, these are quite objectionable little objects, and maybe they need a clip round the ear. I can really imagine that being in O'Brien's mind as well as he sits writing here. Now, Bridget tells Stephen that the Admiral says, because Bridget is on the inside of everybody's gossip now, Bridget says the Admiral says there's a Portuguese coming in, there might be some mail. So Stephen goes and asks whether it's proper to inquire of the Admiral. And on deck, the Admiral, let us say Jack, tells him that it's most improper, and he's surprised that a man with Stephen's sea time could even suppose it was possible or even decent. Now, Jack, who's been watching this Portuguese vessel through his glass since it arrived, says, there's no sign of mail. I see no sign of bags being passed out. There's no hurrying. There's only a gentleman, a military man that has been delivered to Leighton's ship. Here we go. Jack thinks he recognizes the man, but can't put a name to him. Take a look at him, he asks Stephen. And Stephen says, sure, it's very ill-bred, but I might, to make you easy. He might, in other words, take a look through the telescope. Now, he's getting back at Jack for the jab about the mail and kind of teasing Jack for the fact that Jack's been watching out for mail this whole time.
Right.
Looking through the telescope, Stephen recognizes the figure
that's been brought aboard the Portuguese ship. He says, "It is Henry Miller." And Stephen goes very cold here. "He was at Trinity in my time, and he killed Edward Taffy in the 15 acres when I was in my last year." And now it's Jack's turn to recall something about Miller. "Miller? Yes, of course, my neighbour over by Caxley. He must be related to the Admiral. Miller is Lord Leighton's family name, and that person over there often spoke of a peerage going to some fairly close connection. Cousin, of course. They would not be walking arm in arm otherwise." So, we notice this guy Miller. Stephen's response is cold. Jack's is kind of spotting the connection, but not particularly worried. And then Jack asks Stephen about the story of 15 acres. Stephen says that that's where the young men of Trinity College settle matters of honour. And Jack picks up on this known history of Miller's as well. He says, "Oh yes, he killed a gunner officer in Malta too. He's a good shot, has capital pistols, is known in the service as Hair Trigger Miller." And if you want to have a little knowing O'Brien, like, scatological humour aside there, you could go, nudge, nudge, Hair Trigger. I wonder if that's the only thing he's famous for. Jack says, with no idea of this being lighthearted at all, says, "Oh, I've watched him bag many pheasants." And I think we're all meant to think, oh, this guy Miller is the new person on the scene here. He's going after Christina. He's a dueling Irishman. He's a crack shot. And he's the Admiral's cousin and heir. And none of these things make him likely to be a pushover for anybody in our story. And I do just want to point out that it's nice for Trinity College Dublin that, having given Patrick O'Brien lodgings in these final months, he's giving them plenty of name checks. Trinity College was the only sort of higher educational establishment of choice in Dublin at the time. So UCD was still a few decades away, but TCD gets some mentions here. So thank you to TCD and Stephen's alma mater anyhow.
Stephen asks if Miller's quarrelsome. And Jack says, I don't really know him, but I wouldn't value his acquaintance. He says he really doesn't like him. He says that Miller has an indifferent reputation in their neighborhood and has been calling on Edward and Christine at Mendenham, and then at Woolcombe when Christine was staying there. Jack says that he himself is no model for how men should behave around women, but he believes there should be limits. So this is, what Jack is saying. Look, this guy is beyond me in terms of how he deals with women.
That's quite something.
That's something. Yeah. And I'm kind of wondering, well, is that because he's calling on Christine? But no. Jack's heard ugly tales of Miller getting dependents' daughters with child and then turning them away. So this guy is pretty scum here. Yeah. Jack says he's never been married, and as next in line to the Leighton title, is said to be saving himself for a great match. So apparently he's dallying around throughout, leaving all these natural-born children behind and could care less. So, even Jack thinks this guy is a scrub.
Yeah. And we're getting a bit of that sort of social prestige status thing that we talked about in Persuasion as well. It's all kind of very strong echoes of, I'm holding myself out for a good match for the sake of the family and the inheritance. And Stephen just wants to test this out a little bit. He says, can you square a man's valuing a peerage very highly with his going out and risking his life so often? And Jack's got an answer straight away. He says, yes. If he's an unusually resentful, unloved creature, and at the same time, an uncommon good shot. And leaving that kind of dangling there, we get the officer of the watch reporting a signal from the flagship, inviting the Rear Admiral and Dr. spelt out telegraphically Maturin, Maturin, to dinner that day at 3:15. And we go from not minding Miller all that much, even though he's a scrub, to not minding the Admiral. Jack hopes that Stephen doesn't mind that Jack's engaged Stephen to come over with the Admiral for dinner. Stephen says, that's no problem. It wouldn't even matter if I did, he says, because we are all worms under the harrow in the service. Even you, Jack, scintillating in gold lace, are but one of us. I say, come, and he cometh, for I am a centurion. And a continuing roast of Jack Aubrey by Stephen Maturin here. I think it's all good-natured, but I say come and he cometh, Mike. That sounds like it might have a ring from somewhere.
Oh, it does. It does. It's a great New Testament reference, and a story I love as well. In the New Testament, a centurion is a Roman professional soldier who commands a century, 100
Mm.
soldiers. So, hence the name centurion. And the centurion comes to Jesus and says, my servant's at home paralyzed and suffering. And Jesus says, do you want me to come to your house? And the centurion, he's been serving in that area for a long time. He knows something about the culture. He knows that Jesus is a holy man and that he's a Roman, he's a Gentile in Jewish eyes, he's unclean. So he tells Jesus, I'm not worthy to have you under my roof. But if Jesus will just say the word, his servant will be healed. And he compares this to his being a centurion and giving orders. And that's where whether the Matthew or the Luke version in the King James, you say, I say come, and he cometh. So that's there. So this is in the 8th chapter of Mark, the 7th chapter of Luke. Jesus uses this story to say, wow, this guy is a Roman. He's not even one of us Jews here. He's not one of us that believes all this Messiah stuff. And he's got greater faith than most of you guys. So
Yeah.
I love this altogether. And I love, O'Brien with this quick little phrase, and we get to dig it out.
Great. And by the way, I was also thinking it tends to be biblical quotes tend to come from Jack Aubrey, and they tend to be misquotes or misattribution. It's Stephen this time, and he's got the quote and the context and the meaning spot on. So well done, Stephen.
Dead on, exactly.
Yeah. Stephen says he's also happy to go and enjoy men's company. Again, we get a little bit of the slightly churlish, grouchy O'Brien, who's a bit puzzled by all the noise and tumult around young kids. He says, I've been eating breakfast earlier and earlier and dinner later and later to avoid all of the girls' prattle. This breakfast and dinner will soon meet, he says, as they did in Avicenna's tale. And Jack says, well, we'll have a great gun exercise. We've got more powder in store. That's going to quiet down the girls. He says he's going to order the whole shooting match, meaning broadsides and shot at everything. And having stumbled on the witticism about the whole shooting match, repeats it to himself, because as we know, Jack Aubrey's in love with nobody's humor better than he's in love with his own. So Stephen's in quite the quotable mood here. He took care of a New Testament reference and Avicenna. Mike, I've got a feeling that we've met Avicenna before, but what do you think is going on here?
Yeah. And before, we've kind of visited him before as this preeminent philosopher and physician of the Muslim world back in the, like the late 1st century. So, very end. And this guy, famous particularly as a philosopher, as I said, father of early modern medicine. His canon of medicine became a standard medical text. So it was written probably about 1,000 or so, and it's still used as late as 1650 as a medical school text. It's pretty incredible. But here, Stephen Avicenna is the Western name. Ibn Sina would be his name at home. Avicenna was also a famous late-night carouser who often stayed out all night to only catch an hour or two of sleep before starting his morning. So Stephen's trying to say, I'm ending up with Avicenna trying to, get up really early so as not to deal with all the kids, and I'm going to bed later and later. So it's like
kind of the opposite of burning the candle at both ends, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
Wow. So it's funny that they're both channeling Patrick O'Brien. I don't like the noise and fuss of kids around me. And so they both have different ways of dealing with it. As we say, Mike, Jack's way of dealing with it is to serve up the great gun exercise, the whole shooting match, as he had so wittily called it. We get the full-on classic O'Brien description of all of the nuts and bolts of loading and worming and sponging and running out and tackles and, all of the impedimenta of the great gun exercise. It's fabulous. Now, the last gun in the penultimate series finally fires, and we learn that by then, it says in the text, the little girls had almost no voice to screech with, nor even the emotional power to do so. The enormous and repeated din, the vibration of the ship and the air, the great flashes, and the dense clouds of smoke drifting away to leeward had overpowered them, and the near stupefaction of their elders was very impressive too. And this has had absolutely the effect that Jack had hoped for. It's absolutely stung them into silence. The last target rolls down by the ship's side, and a very impressive rolling broadside fired at this last target leaves them little strength to utter the very last "oh" before Killick runs up, screaming to everybody, because his hearing's been blown out by the broadsides as well, screaming that victuals has been laid out 15 minutes ago, until he catches everyone's very disapproving looks. So Killick's chosen his wrong moment to try and exert his authority here. Anyhow, if anybody's got authority to spare, it's Jack, and he calls for his barge because it's time for dinner over on the flagship, right?
Right. Well, despite this huge, and this is not just the regular great gun exercise. I think this might be the first time with Jack that we've seen it on this massive ship, the big Suffolk. I love that. So they've done this, but despite that, they're only a few seconds late. And Lord Leighton, the Admiral, it turns out, is in a good mood. Leighton has thought much about Stephen's close relationship with the man who would likely be the next king. So I think Leighton's kind of adjusted his attitude here. And Leighton jokes about how Jack had nearly split the heavens, talking about this gun exercise here. Thunder and lightning have nothing to compare. He says he hopes that Jack hasn't started too many of the timbers, and wishes that Aubrey had come by the powder honestly. So I think he's thinking that Jack has put on quite the show here. But then he presents his young cousin, Randolph Miller, noting that Miller and Jack are neighbors in the countryside there. And Miller and Jack greet one another. And then Leighton tells Stephen that Leighton's wanted to meet him ever since the Duke of Clarence told him that the doctor was a most uncommonly learned man. And Leighton, the Admiral, says he's particularly learned himself, and he loves to surround himself with others who are. So, boy, I'm sure Stephen is loving that. I'm certainly loving. Oh no, not this. But then he presents Miller, and Stephen says, "That's all right. We've already met. We were at Trinity together." So Stephen kind of cutting that introduction short a little bit here.
It's funny how yet more of this sort of social climbing, socially ambitious. Oh, you're an acquaintance of the king or the Duke of Clarence then. Oh, in that case, you might be worth me talking to you. So we still don't know really how this is all going to play out. The dinner, as it turns out, is great. There's coffee and brandy up on deck afterwards. And there, Admiral Leighton takes Jack to one side and tells him that he wants him to weigh on the ebb and head to St. Helena under easy sail, there to wait until he sees the Admiral plane, because the Admiral's going to come out and catch up. And then once they've had that kind of touching rendezvous, Jack should take his squadron east for the Cape. He says there isn't room for 3 squadrons to lie safely in St. Helena in a strong sou'wester. He also, he says, would like Jack to take his nephew, this guy Miller, along with him. Miller has an appointment at the Cape, needs to get there quickly, and Leighton hopes that Jack will lend Miller his tender if the wind drops, as it so often does. And that's already a pretty long ask. The Admiral risked a bit of a confrontation with Jack over foisting these, supernumeraries on him, and now he's saying, that lovely tender that you have, I'd like you to give it to my man here, if he gets himself caught out in a bit of calm weather. So I'm already feeling a bit uneasy, Mike, about how this is going to work out.
Right. You and me both. Yeah. Well, on deck, Miller comes up to Jack and says he hears with great pleasure that Mrs. Aubrey and Mrs. Woods are aboard and that they'll all be shipmates to the Cape. So Miller's already presumed that Jack said yes, or that, Jack really had no ability to say no here. He brings Jack a brandy and says he had the pleasure of waiting on Mr. Heatherly and his sister at Menningham and with Mrs. Aubrey at Wilcombe, and congratulates Jack on his children. And Jack's thinking, I can't believe Miller is talking to me with this unwarranted degree of familiarity, and thinks, maybe he's had too much to drink. And so he excuses himself and heads over to see Stephen.
Yeah. Kind of disengaging him with this kind of overconfident, slightly creepy, slightly kind of social climbing guy. And meanwhile, the Admiral Leighton is telling Stephen that he plans to tell Napoleon how Napoleon could have avoided defeat at Waterloo. And I'm sure that's a bit of a stretch for anybody to go and see the Emperor and tell him that. Leighton's clearly, therefore, not short of a bit of ego and a bit of confidence of his place on the world stage. And so Leighton turns to Jack and asks him to persuade or even order Dr. Maturin to stay here while he interviews the Emperor General, meaning Bonaparte, because he says the doctor's French is so much better than Leighton's. And again, like, the Admiral is presuming to call upon Stephen's acquaintance with Jack and to sort of make use of him for something that's a bit of a personal vanity project. And already my sensations of Patrick O'Brian dislike, hackles, if you like, are rising against Miller and against his Uncle Leighton here. But Mike, however much we want to hear about this, the typescript, the fully edited, typed out draft of this chapter ends here with this unfinished sentence. "Oh, come, my lord," said Stephen. "What you say sounds..." And we'll never know.
Right.
So it's funny. When we started reading this, Mike, I hadn't twigged that we were going to get 2 abrupt endings. So the first abrupt ending comes here, and I was getting interested in the St. Helena and Miller and Jack, and clearly O'Brien was too, because there's more. But what remains is what perhaps in only a few days O'Brien must have written. So, Mike, what we have from here on is the handwritten manuscript that Patrick O'Brien left. It's never been transcribed directly because it's ambiguous, and clearly O'Brien didn't intend it as something meant for anybody to read, even in draft form. But it's legible enough that people have given it a shot, and we are indebted to Bruce Trank, who formerly of the Gunroom, who transcribed it on the Gunroom's kind of page on hmssurprise.org. And what we've got for the rest of our review of the chapter is handwritten notes. So take us into the handwritten bit here, Mike.
Yeah. So, and part of this, as you say, Ian, it's clear that he's written some sections and then he kind of rewrites it a little bit or tries something different. So what we're going to do is try to take, we're not going to go through all of that here. We're going to try to kind of just steer a current through them so you can get the feel for that. You kind of wonder if when it was rewritten or when he typed it up, he even has some notes here that I need to change the order or I need to add something in that. So we won't talk through all that here. But so just kind of continuing with that unfinished typewritten sentence, Stephen says that the Admiral's French sounds like the French of a northern province, and that Stephen, has patients aboard to whom he owes his first duty. I can't stay. I really have to tend to my patients. And Jack says, "Oh, my lord, even an admiral cannot overrule a medical man. It's in the Articles of War. And even if he could, he would have no success with Maturin. You may turn a bear from his vomit, but I do solemnly affirm that the First Lord of the Admiralty could not turn Maturin from his set course, perverse though it may be." And then Jack thanks him for his hospitality, takes his leave, and says, "Oh, yes, I will, by the way, carry your nephew to the Cape here." And I thought, turn a bear from his vomit. One last Aubreyism in all this. So Jack is confusing. As you said, Ian, Stephen quotes the Bible correctly all the time. Jack always mangles it. He's confusing Proverbs 26:11, which says, "As a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool repeats his folly." But Jack has him turning away from the vomit, and of course inserts one last bear reference, which we remember so well from Post Captain and other places.
Great. And in another ending, another way of working this little plot line through that O'Brien has written, we have a scene set in the evening. Jack adds that some of the people on the sick list are in what he calls a parlous state, an uncertain or a dangerous state. And Maturin and Jacob are going to have to operate on a strangled hernia. The Admiral says, "Well, if this operation's a bloody affair, I'll recommend it to Miller because he might want to watch." But saying that the guy walks miles to see lambs and bullocks being castrated. However, the full trade winds then pick up, and the Admiral sends Jack and Stephen off to set sail. They cover 300 miles on the first day without touching tack or sheet. So you'll be pleased to know that even this late on, O'Brien was still using those nice tropes about good sailing weather. But they miss their splendid navigators. And these two names are dropped in, I think, for the first time, Hansen and Daniel. And I don't know whether he's talking about midshipmen or... I thought Daniel died. Was he not? No. Gagan was the oboe player. Daniel was the other midshipman. Okay, I'm struggling to keep track. But Mike, I want to go back to this expression of Miller's odd character being that he appreciates watching farm animals being castrated. It's a really sort of sleazy, awkward, horrible characterization for Miller. And it's something that O'Brien has talked about before. And Dean King told us that in the biography of O'Brien, he discovered the time that O'Brien had spent in this farm in Wales. And this idea of witnessing the castration of livestock actually also then came up in one of O'Brien's other novels. In the novel Richard Temple, one of these characters is talked about as kind of almost relishing the sight of this seasonal castration of young animals. And it's an odd little personal echo of O'Brien's own experience, but it makes us feel really uneasy about this character Miller and what he likes and his attitude to cruelty and blood.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so O'Brien continues on and it tells us that Jack's twins start actually growing offensively knowledgeable about seagoing affairs, but thankfully Padine and Bridget keep them, within bounds, they call it. And life is going on aboard ship. Miller calls on the ladies to play cards every day, but with very little success. So it's interesting. We're quickly getting into it, and it almost read to me, Ian, like O'Brien wasn't adding all the flourishes, but he was kind of getting his plot line down here, because then we kind of jump ahead.
Right. So we strike soundings on the west coast of Africa, getting close to a place called Loando, and there's a couple of interesting things about this. First of all, we get a note about Miller climbing up in the rigging to be the first one to glimpse the shore. And in the manuscript, O'Brien writes that this is conceivably a symbol of power, status, and indeed perhaps marriage. And I don't know quite why he would connect elevated viewpoints and perspectives with marriage, or maybe that he's, his attitude to marriage is that it's about a climb up the social ladder. But it's certainly not the first time that O'Brien has used climbing or upward mobility as a symbol of status, a symbol of enlightenment, or indeed the first time that O'Brien's used other kind of vertical transport metaphors. He's talked about falling and descending, signifying the opposite, signaling, career setbacks and even death. Remember the symbolism of Jack stuck in a well in Malta with Ponto the dog. So he's clearly got all of his symbolism chops going here. Meanwhile, this place, Loando, the kingdom of Loando, as we kind of find out from looking it up here, is the western part of the Republic of the Congo on the west shore of Africa. And Mike, to me, it sounds phonetically similar to the name of Luanda, which is the modern capital of Angola and just down the west coast from the modern day Congo. So I don't know if they're the same thing or related. We also learned that they managed to get an observation. So they've got confidence that they know their position. And just as this happens, the sky splits, bellowing and thunder all night. St. Elmo's fire, loss of sails, the deck never stopping moving, taking on lots of water, pumping. So we're back in an almost desolation island type storm situation here. They use their boats to help get a fisherman to shore and are well received by the other Loando fishermen, who it turns out are relatives of the one that they had saved. And again, Mike, this would well be O'Brien just sketching out some plot ideas that he's going to fill in later on. And I'm also thinking, getting ashore in a storm and meeting friendly fishermen, this sounds like the opposite of the terrible situation of the boats from the Wager back on the unknown shore, which seems to have been in Patrick O'Brien's mind a little bit here. Anyway, we've had the shore and we've had the fishermen, and now it seems that we're back in naval territory once again.
Yeah, it looks like the entire squadron is somehow together now, and they throw a feast for the exhausted hands. And I kind of went back and I wondered, that big storm, they had an observation, but then there's this storm. I was thinking, is this when they're going to miss their navigators? But I don't know. That doesn't seem to be picked up here because they've made it. Everybody's there. The admiral, it says, Leighton is housed in the governor's house, and Jack, his family, and the senior officers are in a former military compound, a command there. And everybody is working on repairing their ships from the storm. So apparently, a lot of people had gotten hit in this storm. Stephen is now going to operate on this hernia, the hernia that they had originally told the Admiral about right before they left. And the Admiral says Miller would like to see it. So Stephen finds Miller and invites him, but Miller, who's on his daily visit to the ladies and is bringing flowers to Mrs. Woods, declines. So now, I'm not going to miss this bloody operation because I'm taking flowers to Christina. Wow.
Foolish man. If only he knew just how close he was bringing himself to disaster here. Christine recruits the help of Stephen and asks Stephen to tell Miller not to call unless invited. He is, as she describes him, a wonderfully confident nuisance. Miller has bragged to Christine that when he takes up his position at the Cape, when he marries the woman he chooses, no one will compare to him in wealth and influence. And he's clearly hinting that he thinks that she should hitch up with him. And these are Christine's words to Stephen. I have met with some fools in my life, even some goddamned fools, and a good many of them, but I have never met with such a confident ass as Miller. I suppose he is completely blinded by his position, appointment, and, I dare say, wealth, as well as gross stupidity. Stephen, she says, please get me rid of him. He is making me ridiculous, as well as himself. And now, Mike, it's time for Stephen to step in and do what Stephen needs to do, right?
Right. Stephen quietly tells Miller that Mrs. Woods begs that he will not call again without an invitation. Miller calls Stephen a liar and strikes him. Stephen tells Miller to arrange for his seconds, that Harding and Joseph, it says in the text, I wondered if it meant Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob.
Will be his seconds, and they will meet early tomorrow morning. Stephen tells, it says again, Joseph, I think it's Jacob's, that he's sorry he's tangled him in this silly affair before he's answered Jacob's questions about Argentina. Jacob asks if they have time for the hernia before talking politics, since they have to sail early tomorrow afternoon. Jacob says, I should imagine so. A really healthy, lean patient with a simple hernia is no great matter, and I've already coded the essence of my report. And a simple affair of this kind, a blow given and resented, is no greater matter either. Small enough on the level ground behind the groin, a little after sunrise with a stretcher, his man, and a local surgeon. You expect no serious injury? Oh, no, a pierced shoulder at the most. Well, very well. Let us look at our patient and perhaps operate at once, even at the cost of landing him until the exercise is over.
Wow.
And my takeaway is that this is a little nonchalant for this upcoming duel against this crack shot, given we know that, Stephen really wasn't in, the highest command of his last duel that he went out trying to win Canning. That's been a while ago, and I'm sure he's better, but little worried here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm worried as well that Stephen is nonchalant about this. That's normally a sign that we ought to worry. But there's another part of me, Mike, that is just thinking he's been an ass toward Christine. He's just obviously an ass, and I just want Stephen to get rid. I think this guy needs taking down. So I'm wondering whether this is meant to be jeopardy for Stephen, or whether we're meant to be kind of on the conveyor belt of Stephen taking care of business here. Let's see what happens. The hernia, as it turns out, goes well. The patient is put ashore before the ship's great gun exercise. And the rumor of the duel reaches the ears of Admiral Lord Leighton, who's worried that his nephew, as he learns, has refused to fight with swords and wants to fight only with the pistol. But it turns out the Maturin's seconds had said no. Their principal was the one who received the blow, so he gets to choose the weapon. That was indeed the case, says the text. It had always been the case. It was the law of Moses. Well, I don't think it was the law of Moses. I think it was the law of 18th century Ireland, but never mind. The Admiral sends his man, somebody by the name of Martin, out to tell his nephew, to tell Miller, that if he doesn't fight, he's disgraced forever and can expect no notice from him or from the ministry. A sword wound, he says, from a reasonably decent creature, meaning Maturin, is not so bad. And Mike, we get very quickly, as O'Brien is sketching the plot line out here, we get very quickly to the scene of the duel. We're out there on the field and everybody's present.
Yeah. And on the field, Miller is being urged on by his seconds, and he keeps telling them, no, this is unfair. I would meet any man with a pistol, but I know nothing about swords. And O'Brien writes, they, shamefaced, kept telling him it was the law of the duel. He could either apologize on his knees, using any terms his adversary saw fit to impose, or he must fight. There were no two ways about it. And then Mr. Martin, the admiral's man, comes over and whispers into his ear, your uncle will not speak to you if you do not fight. Well, that kind of changes things.
It really does. So he has to proceed. They finally get him out there holding a sword on the ground for the duel. There are a few clashes, and of course, this is Stephen Maturin. Miller's sword flies into the air, flung from his grip by Maturin. Stephen puts his sword point onto Miller and asks whether he withdraws his words entirely. He does. Stephen says, then we have said enough. Good day to you, gentlemen, and I thank you heartily for your presence. Now, Mike, we were wondering which of two duel-ish episodes is this going to be flashing back to? Is it going to be flashing back to Canning and death and disaster and uncertainty? Actually, it's flashing back to the episode between Stephen and the colonel or the judge or whoever it was in Sydney in Australia, where he fell out and basically pushed him to the ground and said, apologize or you're a dead man. And I'm super happy. I'm absolutely Team Stephen here. I'm so glad that this ignorant ass Miller has been shown what's what. So happy days.
Yes. Well, we go on now, and we're going to do Miller in just a little bit more. Wainwright, who is Miller's servant, but who very much dislikes Miller, is telling Killick that Miller shared it all with a set of tarts. So I guess Miller went and got up with some ladies of the evening and was telling this story, and that he's now hiding out in a little cabin behind his lordship and probably won't come out. Wainwright says, no one who's refused to fight could face others. And his lordship, meaning Miller's father, his lordship, Leighton, had gone out many times and always came back bloodied. So I guess Miller's still disgraced. He went out, but he didn't come back bloodied. So he really didn't do his job.
No. And we've got to wonder, as we're in the final lines here, was Miller ever going to kind of come back and get some kind of sneaky vengeance? Like a Ray or a Ledward on Stephen for humiliating him? Was he just going to creep off the scene? And was Stephen and Christine going to do their own complicated story about their romance and getting back together? We'll never know. Yeah. Miller doesn't, in fact, come out for the great gun exercise or for the small arms exercise that he himself had trained some of the Marines for. He went into the wardroom to find a paper where no one was there, and ended up frequently changing his uniform because he was always sweating, and he was inclined to blame his servant for any slip. And now we're in the final line here, Mike. Give us the last known words that we have from Patrick O'Brien.
Yeah, these are these last known words. It says, some days of quite untypical S for South African weather slowed the squadron, then crossed out and possible, but he writes, and it crossed out was, well, and then there's an insert here. The person says, it might have meant may here. It may well have been during the conversation, and that's it. That's the, as Ian pointed out, that's the second unfinished sentence and the last unfinished sentence in this 21 book journey.
Wow. And it's a completely everyday moment, and it just trails off. And
right.
Yeah. Patrick O'Brien, at this point, we don't know how many hours or days before his death this was, but that was the last thing that he wrote. It does feel odd, Mike. Like we've been sort of looking over the guy's shoulder as he was drafting this thing, and it has a very different feeling for me from reading the typescript before, which was kind of moving towards what he intended to share. But we heard so much about the story. We've heard so much about Stephen and the duel and Jack and the family. I don't know. You go first. How are you feeling about having got all the way through 21 here?
Well, I started it thinking it'd be completely unfair to compare any of this to the books earlier. I mean, These are his notes. It's not ready for publication. We've got a couple of initial corrections. I'm also thinking mentally and emotionally, where is this guy now?
Yeah.
Not to mention, I can empathize where he is age-wise, and he's just been outed in the press. So this is when everybody is now publishing about, O'Brien is not O'Brien and he's not Irish. This guy who's revered his privacy all his life, and says it's not. Even writes in our great canon about it's not polite to ask questions. I'm sure having all these people hounding him about that, it's clear, reading his stepson's biography that he was worried that he thought people were stealing some of the pages of his manuscript, and it wasn't organized. So we don't know his state of mind. But with all these caveats, I'm kind of looking at this going, a decent editor or a colleague, or God bless her, if only Mary was still around, I think this is the beginning of a great book. And I certainly would love to read it.
Yeah, me too. And I'm not that surprised, but I'm kind of relieved. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about picking up 21. But I'm really glad that I did. All those great moments like the reunion with Sam and the children and the funniness with the kind of loving the family, but then also not loving the family being around. I thought that was really great. And this arc now with Stephen and Christine and Miller, it is, we've talked about this before. It's like the end of The Sopranos where it just falls black. The end of The Sopranos was meant to be that way, but it says when a story ends, sometimes the story just ends. But here, due to force of circumstances, the story just ends, and it feels kind of fitting. And certainly, Mike, reading it has got you and me to, as the text says, a state of laudable and permanent humility.
Right.
Which
Always
is where lovers need to end up. We've got all the interfamily dynamics. We've got the relationship with Christine, and I'm super happy that the relationship with Christine is at least partly still on. We've got some old favorite plot ideas. We've got a grouchy admiral who thinks too much of himself and his own capabilities. We've got people missing, like excellent navigators. We know what kind of jeopardy that could bring. We've got potential action now because we're in South Africa. We're away from Europe where peace has broken out, and we're in the colonies where who knows what could occur. The Miller-Maturin rivalry seems to have been resolved quickly, but Miller's still there and humiliated. And as we said a minute ago, who knows how that might have ended up. And Jack, meanwhile, is aboard the ship of the line. He's admiral. He's got a good complement of hands. He's got many of his old friends and followers with him. But we've got a mission ahead of us here that could have changed all of that.
Right. And I think we had that early suggestion in 21 that Maturin and Jacob may actually have an intelligence mission even further east than Africa. So it could be like one of those other O'Brien books where all this is we're going to West Africa, but who knows where this may lead us. Do we think that this is the final story of the canon? I don't think so. Or the final story for both or either of our heroes. Yeah, I think you and I have talked about this. We think clearly both the heroes are intended to get to the end of this book. He had given an interview right after the book before this saying that he already had this one going and he doesn't feel comfortable unless he has one in progress. So I think this was just another one. And I kind of thought that I might be a little upset with no more Aubrey Maturin to come. But, and we even thought about doing this, as you said, with the Sopranos ending, that we might just read this and this was months ago when we thought we might just read, the unfinished sentence and just cut to black like the Sopranos had. But I now think, one of the things the Sopranos did was you're wondering, what happens next? Because clearly something happens next. And I'm feeling a little bit like, absolutely. We haven't come to an end. The end hasn't been written. Piece of me still has them sailing. The journey is indeed the unfinished and will remain the unfinished journey here. And as long as the journey is unfinished, I can be going back with them time and time again, fully immersed in this world. and travel through, perhaps not in new ones, but with continued circumnavigations, as so many people do, seeing new things in them each and every time.
Absolutely. It's great. And the fact that he's built up these characters so richly means that actually the plot is secondary to us enjoying spending time with the characters. And who wouldn't want to go back and spend time with the characters again? And Mike, you and I have really enjoyed the extra bits of the O'Brien world that we've dug into. So we're looking forward to spending time with Stephen and Jack. We're looking forward maybe to spending time with Peter and Sean and with Jack Byron and Toby from the Unknown Shore again, because they all kind of belong in this set of worlds that O'Brien created. We've talked a lot about everything that we've loved and appreciated about the books, and I think we can borrow some words from somebody else that ring very well, thinking about O'Brien and his achievement in getting to this point and his writing of the final book. If you're thinking of getting a copy of 21, it's worth it for all of the things that we've enjoyed, and also for this really brilliant afterword written by American historical novelist and journalist Richard Snow. And he points out that the last that we read of Jack and Stephen, at that moment, O'Brien has written them into, as Richard Snow says, a rare state of almost perfect felicity. And then Snow goes on and describes all of the good things that the text leaves us with, all the good things that this leaves our heroes with. And he adds this: remember that this was written at a time when the author was lonely and tormented, yet Patrick O'Brien has given a farewell to his followers that is as gracious as it is gallant. And we, in turn, may find some solace in the thought that, of all people, this man would not have hated to be taken out of action much as Nelson was, deep in triumph, shedding glory on the service he loved, and still at the peak of his powers. So what a great way to think about the author and where he is and where he's headed to and what it all means. And Mike, it's hard to put a lid on all the things that we've said and thought about the books, but there is a brilliant piece on the back of this edition of 21, the words of Amanda Foreman from the New York Times. Do you want to help us to that?
Yeah. I mean, she says, there is nothing in this century that rivals Patrick O'Brien's achievement in his chosen genre. His novels embrace with loving clarity the full richness of the 18th century world. They embody the cruelty of battle, the comedy of men's lives, the uncertain fears that plague their hearts, and yet, not far away, is the vision of an ideal existence. And I absolutely underscore Amanda Foreman's words. And I would also insert that there's a whole world of women that is so rich in this thing as well. So, it's not only the comedy of men's lives, and maybe she's meaning men as inclusive here, but, all of this so far, it's meant so much to all of us.
The vision of an ideal existence and the characters and the friendship, it's been a real privilege to be with it, right?
In addition, kind of leaving our heroes in the state of felicity and on an ongoing voyage, I'm so grateful to have spent this circumnavigation with my particular friend, Ian Bradley, and with you, all of our messmates and friends of the Lover's Hole. Thank you for journeying with us. Thanks for structuring my retirement, for getting me through COVID, several house and farm moves, American politics, another brief cancer visit. Thanks for letting me share the journey with a succession of pets. Mosey and Pete say hi. Good. Louis, the quiet one, lost the number of his mess at the end of this journey. I've got 2 new pups here. The horses are glad to hear that more riding time is on the horizon. Absolutely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity, too, to leave behind my voice, to share my love of these great books and this wonderful community that reads them, hoping that maybe one day one of my grandkids or kids or just a friend may find it in this community. And that extra special thanks to my particular friend and partner, Ian Bradley, without whom the idea, the reality, the technology, the social media, the guest arrangements, the Patreon support, the shop, any of this would come to pass. And special thanks to Sam, who's been instrumental in tirelessly bringing the magic to life.
Yeah, thank you, Sam.
Huge thanks to my wife, Annie, Ian's wife, Joy, who've been so incredibly supportive throughout, too, for this little endeavor that we were going to run through in 20 weeks and, just have fun.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'd like to say thank you as well. First of all, to my particular friend, Mike Shank, for bringing the show to the start line every week with pretty much all of the notes and references and research. But not only that, for bringing the real heart and soul of The Lover's Hole, bringing all the humanity and all the joy of reading. Mike, thank you. It's been awesome. To everybody who ever reached out to say hello or offer a thought, offer appreciation or advice, all of you listeners, some of it unspoken, but some of it on our social media channels and some of it in our live interactions with you. We've really valued the time with you in conversation. Some of you even ascending to the lofty heights of the upper tiers of the Patreon supporters group. We really appreciate from all of you the happy memories and many, many new friendships. In particular, to the Patreon supporters whom we've already thanked in person, we want to say thank you all over again. If you hadn't offered your support in the early weeks and months of the podcast and given us the resources to put the show on a stable footing, it would have remained, as you say, Mike, a 20-episode experiment and not a 220-episode juggernaut. And as you say, Mike, the juggernaut would have left the road quite a few times if it hadn't been for the skill and patience of Sam, who's stuck with us. By the way, Mike and I decided on a whim on about episode 2 to do a little outtake about goat's milk. And that little instant tradition of bloopers and outtakes has cursed poor old Sam forever to be sifting through outtakes for every episode for bloopers. So Sam, thank you. We hope that you're going to miss working on the show. But we also know that there are some things about it that you might not miss and that there are even more exciting things coming in the future. We know that you won't miss the hunting for the bloopers. To everybody who's enjoyed the show as a regular listener, please know that you got all of this great stuff because of the generosity of all these people. And a special word as well to say thank you to all of our guests, many of whom have become long-time friends of the show and friends of me and Mike. Yeah. They've been friendly and knowledgeable and super generous. And so many of them have stayed in touch with us over the years. You know who you are, and we're really proud to count you as friends of the show. Speaking of unfinished journeys, we'll keep a weather eye on our social channels. We're not going to disappear from Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. We hope that we'll stay across whatever's happening in the world, particularly with regard to the O'Brien fandom. And Mike, who knows, perhaps one day a new Aubrey Maturin movie, maybe even a TV series might come out.
I'd like to think that if that happens, we might just journey over to Sepping's yard, give our name to the Admiral's clerk, and board the Dear Surprise once more, taking our place and welcoming you back to the Lover's Hole.
Mike, do you know what? I should have liked that of all things.
The music room in the governor's house at Port Mahon, a tall, handsome, pillared octagon, was filled with the triumphant first movement of Locatelli's C major quartet. The players, Italians pinned against the far wall by rows and rows of little round gilt chairs, were playing with